this video, I do something different. I usually do the fountain pen videos and that sort of thing, and try my hand a little bit at comedy. But I wanted to talk about something a little bit more important, and I didn't prepare a lot in advance for this, so it's more of an attempt to put out some feelers to see if people are interested in what I might have to say or to discuss this topic or these topics further. And if you're watching this video, you're probably familiar with Jordan B. Peterson. One of my younger brothers introduced me to him, and I found him pretty interesting. And I thought he had a lot of very poignant ideas. And I found myself sort of voraciously just listening to different videos that he did and watching interviews that people had done with him as their guest. And then ultimately ended up watching some videos with him talking with Sam Harris and talking with, oh man, his name's escaping right now, Ben Shapiro, and the other gentleman whose name I forget. I'm sorry about that. I had just learned about you today. So, anyway, what excites me about this new group of interlocutors that I've recently delved into a little bit is the fact that they don't agree on everything, and yet they have great conversations. And I think that's extremely important. For a very long time, I have bemoaned the level of dialogue taking place in our culture, on our news channels, in the classroom. I mean, I have both been a doctoral student as well as a college instructor, I'll say. I wasn't a full-fledged professor, but I was a lecturer and teaching fellow at two different universities. And to give you a little bit of background about myself, I grew up in a pretty conservative home, I would say. And I've remained relatively conservative. However, while in my youth, I found the likes of Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter and those sorts of people interesting, and I would, sort of rally kind of thing. As I matured, I got away from that. And it wasn't that I disagreed with their positions. It wasn't that I changed my fundamental views, although I think some of my views probably have changed or at least become more nuanced as I've grown and developed, which is something I've always striven for. Because, I mean, if I only knew or thought exactly the same way I did at the age of 12 as I do at the age of 38, then I think there would be a very big problem, and I would have stunted maturity. So that would be a very bad thing. Truth. I think in the end, that has always been a hallmark of my life, that the truth matters. And if I am wrong, do I want to know? That's a question I think every single person has to ask themselves. They have to sincerely ask themselves, if you are wrong, do you want to know? And I can say, yes. I find no desire to be right for the sake of being right. I mean, or to think that I'm right when I'm not actually right. Deception is not really something I'm into. And I'm sure we're all a little bit self-deceived to some extent, just because our perceptions, even of ourselves, are limited. That's just sort of, being fallible, not omniscient human beings. But as I've grown and matured, I've found that I started getting irritated with people that I agreed with, meaning the people that had the same fundamental conclusions as I did regarding politics, economics, morality even. And I would get increasingly frustrated with them to the point where I didn't like listening to them. I get nothing out of a pep rally. I really don't. So, while I traditionally was a Republican for a long time, and I still lean that direction, I've had to disassociate myself with the Republican Party for a number of reasons, and it's not just because of Trump, okay? I'm not even going to go into that whole thing because it's not the most important thing to me right now, even though our news cycle would say it's the most important thing in the history of mankind, apparently. And I somewhat get it, but that's not where I'm at. My disillusionment came a long time before that, and it bothers me that our news outlets, typically speaking, do not really present things, or even, like political debates specifically, on much better than 8th grade level. And that means that the best people we have in office, on the right and the left, whether, I'm not saying that they're only capable of this, I'm just talking about what they actually do when they're trying to get elected. To appeal to the masses, they talk at a very low level, which means that the rest of us who actually want to be challenged in what we think and try to understand things better and see where people are coming from are left just disgusted and upset because every single person that seems to get on that debate stage, maybe not every single, but most of the time, comes across as just saying platitudes and stating preconceived platforms, or, with minor tweaks here and there. But it means that our leaders seem very unsophisticated, and our news cycle has perpetuated that insofar as the most important way to win a debate is through grandeur. It's rhetoric, and it drives me up the wall. Because if you can insult the other person the best, so you have the most witty comeback, you somehow have won the political debate or the moral debate. If you can talk the other person down or shout over them, then you've won. You can label them with an adjective, whatever that adjective is. I don't care if you're saying, oh, well, you're just a conservative, or you're just a liberal, or you're a tree hugger, or you're whatever phobic, because apparently if you disagree with something, then that makes you afraid of it. I don't necessarily think that's true. But anyway, I'm just really pleased, whether you agree with them or not. And that's one of the things that excites me. I don't agree with any of them 100%. I don't agree with Jordan B. Peterson on everything. I don't agree with Ben Shapiro on everything. I certainly don't agree with Sam Harris on a lot of things. And yet I'm able to enjoy listening to their conversations because that's what civil discourse is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be just this emotionally charged will to power thing. This Nietzschean notion of I just assert myself as much as I possibly can, and the louder I speak, the more I shout, the more outrage I can show, the more right I am. That's not true. Yes, we all get emotional over things that are important to us. That doesn't make us right. And I think we all have to admit that. And, for a long time, I've thought that humility really is the virtue of virtues. Now, you can argue that it's charity, and I won't dispute that. I do think charity is the most important in some respect. What I mean is humility is the most fundamentally important insofar as without humility, other virtues become vices. Because they become a source of pride. And any other virtue infused with pride, it leads to hubris. And so I think the most fundamental thing we need is a little bit more of humility. And humility to me does not mean temerity at all. It doesn't mean that I don't express my thoughts. It doesn't mean that I don't assert, put forth my values. It doesn't mean I don't vote the way that I see or make arguments. That's not what humility means. Humility doesn't mean, it just means recognizing that I'm not the source of truth, and recognizing the fact that my ability to perceive and know and articulate the truth is limited, that I am finite. And what has disturbed me, I think, to give a little bit of my position on things, is precisely postmodernism, and to a certain extent modernism itself. So And there's a whole host of things I could say about that. Um, but especially the postmodern notion that there really is no truth. You know, relativism, subjectivism, whatever you want to call it. You know, it does reduce everything to just power, like in a power struggle, and rather than a common search for truth. And I had very powerful moments in my life that, you know, I've always kind of fundamentally had the same disposition of search for truth. And scary moments when I thought, well, maybe I've been wrong, and or I still think I'm right, but I don't know how to answer this particular person's objection in this moment. Which means, oh no, what do you do? Do I ignore that? You know, no. You know, I walk away wondering and think, oh, well, yeah, I need to think about that. And we don't have enough of that in our society. We don't have enough discussions. We get in a lot of heated arguments. You know, I've pretty much stopped watching news from any outlet on any sort of regular basis. Obviously, I still have to watch it occasionally. I do want to know what's going on in the world. But most news isn't about what's going on in the world. It's about what's going on in the pundits' heads, and everything has become op-ed. You know, pretty much. I mean, almost every 24-hour news cycle, and there's less news than there ever has been. Because it's not news, it's all interpretive assertions, and, you know, no one seems to be fair and balanced for the most part. And it's sad, but I found more in the last few days listening to these videos and podcasts from these people on YouTube than I have in the prior 2 decades from the news outlets. You know, I've heard more productive conversations in this short period of time than I ever have in watching all of the debates from both parties and between the parties, including watching debates from, like, England and things. So, I think that's great because I want to encourage that kind of dialogue. That, you know, I've always wanted to be able to just talk to someone whom I disagree with without getting in a shouting match and getting all puffed up and angry and using insults. Because most of our political debates on both sides of the spectrum come down to ad hominem attacks. And that's why I don't particularly care for Ann Coulter anymore. You know, I'm not saying she's not right on some things. I'm not even saying I disagree with some things. But I do not find insults to be convincing to anyone nor helpful. It doesn't make you wrong just because you use insults, but it doesn't make you right either. It's one thing to point out inconsistencies in people's logic, and there's one way to talk to people that are your friends and that you agree with to sort of just vent out your anger. Okay, that's fine. But you don't use that to the other person. If you treat them with disrespect, you're not going to win them over. No one has said, you're right, you insulted me so much that I now agree with you. That has never happened, as far as I know, in the history of human discussion. No one gets insulted into agreeing unless they're being brainwashed or, you know, tortured. So I don't understand that. You know, the people that I don't agree with don't agree with me for reasons that they have most of the time. I'm not... And maybe I'm giving postmodernism too much of a credit there because they don't seem to believe in truth. So that might be an exception. I don't know. But even then, they actually do have reasons, even if they don't know what they are. They do have some value that they're putting forward at the bare minimum. And so we can't just assume that our enemies are our enemies because they're stupid. There are smart conservatives, there are smart liberals, there are smart moderates. You know, it's not a matter of intelligence per se. There's a lot of stupid, smart people out there, if you know what I'm saying. I mean, let's face it. You go back to Nazi Germany, to borrow something from Ratzinger's memoirs, right? And I'm paraphrasing it, but basically in his own experience of growing up in Germany during the rise of Nazi power, which his father was strongly against, so much so that, you know, his father being a policeman in rural areas of Bavaria, they kept having to move towns because he would get in trouble for speaking out against the brown shirts, because he was very anti-Nazi. And, he in his own memoirs portrays this dichotomy between the intellectual elite, the academics, versus the Bavarian farmers, right? Who bought into the Nazi ideology, National Socialism? Who bought into it? Who bought into genocide? Right? Who bought into the horrors that were Auschwitz and Dachau? Okay? Yeah, I'm not saying there weren't any people that were smart, or that were not of lower intellectual capacity, but the people that pushed the agenda and carried it out primarily were the academic elite. Okay? They were the doctors, the lawyers, the politicians. They were the ones that Hitler was able to win over first and foremost. And the humble Bavarian farmer, on the other hand, very often wanted nothing to do with it. And that took place specifically in the schools, right? So the Nazi regime takes over, and they want to replace the traditional Bavarian, thoughts on religion and culture even. And these teachers coming from university wanted to replace it with this sort of neo-pagan sort of culture forcefully, and say, well, this is what we're going to do anymore. The Bavarians wanted nothing to do with it. Their culture was deeper than that. So very often, you have humble people that are not necessarily well educated that just see through the BS. Whereas smart people, intelligent people, can talk themselves into anything as long as they see it as advantageous. And therefore, a lot of intelligent people, I think, unfortunately, because of their pride and arrogance, don't see their own prejudice. They talk about the prejudice of other people. I only believe the way I do because I was raised in a certain way, in a certain place, in a certain environment, which, I've actually been raised in several places, but they never seem to apply that to themselves. It seems to me, I could be wrong, but a lot of them, it seems to me, are of the illusion that doesn't apply to them, that they transcend any sort of prejudice, which is why they're so certain that they're right and everyone else is wrong. And I am certain that I'm right on a lot of things, okay, but I don't expect everyone else to be so certain that I am on those things. But the things that I am the most certain about don't come from me. Okay, they're not things that I came up with. And so that's where the humility comes into play. You can be very confident and still be humble. That I learned things that I firmly believe to be true, that I've also thought about and make a lot of sense, more so than, almost anything else, or actually more so than anything else. And so I have a lot of confidence in those things. But it doesn't lead me to pride, because I'm not right, because I created it. I see it as right because it precedes me, and it will live long after me, because truth is truth. I am not the beginning and ending of truth. And so that's like my fundamental starting point. And what I like about the conversations I've been hearing from them, even though I don't agree with any of them 100%, and even collectively they don't touch on everything that I believe in or think, the fact that they're able to have that dialogue, because, the logos, the word, rationale, reason, needs to also be dialogue, reasoning through, not just individually, but collectively, or, in dialogue, back and forth, I have found that in my own experience that I can have what seem to me to be profound thoughts in my own reflection. But I have had much greater insights through dialogue, in talking with other people that were also interested in the topic and had a common desire for truth. Okay, those were the things that got me thinking the most, of being open to listening, but not just accepting everything, but having that back and forth. And it tended to create a spiral where the conversation got better and better, in that dialogue. Me, as a Catholic Christian, yes, I see Trinitarian background behind that. I don't expect everyone else to. But interpersonal communion, I think, is the beginning and end of humanity. I think it's the source and summit of humanity. And that's something that Ratzinger himself said in The Nature and Mission of Theology, right? That you have to have, in order to have dialogue, a fundamental basis of that is the same agreement there is a truth to be discussed. And that's what worries me about postmodernism, is the lack of truth. If you don't agree that there is some truth that you're both seeking after and trying to get to, and about which you currently have a disagreement, if you don't agree with that, then there's no point of dialogue. And the only thing you can do is beat the other person over the head with a club. Right? Because what's the point of talking if there is no truth that we can get behind? It might not be a literal club. It might be a metaphorical club. Well, I just insult you until you back down, and I scare other people away from holding your position because they don't want to be insulted either. It's still a club. It's still violence. It's still not a very sophisticated or moral or valuable way of acting as a human being. So I would argue that we need to at least model, if not the content, at least the manner in which people like Jordan B. Peterson and his interlocutors are speaking, and Ben Shapiro and Sam Harris. And I disagree with all of them on certain things. But one thing I can't agree with them is that civil discourse needs to be that way, and it needs to be open and honest. And by open, it doesn't just, I think, meaning receptive, actively receptive to what other people have to say, and not feeling threatened by that. This idea that, oh no, what they said, I disagree with it. Oh my gosh, my home, it's life. We live in a fallen world is the way I would phrase it. You can phrase it however you want, an imperfect world or whatever, that's fine. But we're not going to get beyond that if we just refuse to listen and we just want to talk over everyone. I get no joy out of having the same conversation with people over and over again about the same things and just complaining. I mean, it seems like most of our public discourse now is, or even personal private conversations nowadays, tend towards, can you believe those people, they're idiots, man. I can't believe the people on the other side of the aisle are just morons. They're all stupid. Well, that sort of talk isn't exactly intelligent. It's not very sophisticated. It's very sophomoric at best. So why do we always engage in it? It's just, chest thumping. It doesn't get us anywhere as a society or as individuals. Puffing up our pride is not valuable. Now, confirming one another, in the struggles that we have, that's different. I agree with you. It's sad that certain people think that the way they do. It's perfectly valid to think that way. It's valid for, or at least allowable for other people to think that, for instance, the way I think is concerning. Great, let's talk about it. One, you might not understand what I actually think, and don't assume that you do. You can't base any individual's thought just on sound bites, right? It's very difficult to get to the full iteration of one's philosophy and understanding. I experience this in class sometimes, or just in conversation with people, and say, well, why do you believe this? And I'm going, oh my gosh, instantaneously you have there's 40 other things we'd have to discuss before you can even understand that. So I don't even know how to tell you. Not because I don't know, because I don't know how to answer that in 5 minutes. I mean, And I think we need to assume that that's true with other people as well. We can't if you can answer my question in 5 minutes, then you're just stupid and you're wrong. Well, no, that's why the news also doesn't work. You bring on experts, you let them talk for 30 seconds at a time, and you have three of them, and you do it in 3 minutes. You just wasted their expertise because no one's learning anything from that other than the fact that he disagrees with him and she disagrees with her, and they all disagree with one another, and they have different viewpoints, and some of them can yell louder than others. It's not helpful. I wish we had presidential debates, for instance, that were literally people talking to one another. Instead, it becomes an interview, a multi-subject interview with interruptions. That's what we've reduced our presidential debates to, candidate debates, right? It's, this reporter asked this person a question that's might be actually a very good question. The person has a very short period of time to answer it, and then they ask the next person, why are you in this race when you don't have much support? And they don't even get to address the actual issue, which sort of fulfills the prophecy of them not getting much support because they never get a chance to talk about anything important. And then people get to interrupt each other, and well, he mentioned my name, so I get to speak again. So what do? It's like they have this unspoken agreement. We're going to mention each other's names, so these other people don't even get a chance. And in the end, we'll duke it out. It's ridiculous. Lincoln Douglas style debate or something. I don't know. Like have a round robin where it's just two of them at a time or three. But in other words, there's no more dialogue, and that's why we don't seem to be getting anywhere in society. And it has become just a will. Let me push my agenda forcefully, strongly, and that's how I'm going to win. And that doesn't bode well for our society at all. And so I want to encourage them to continue this sort of dialogue in this mode of discussion, because we can all learn from it. And maybe eventually the news outlets will too. Maybe they will actually begin to take seriously proper dialogue and the importance that it has. I meant to talk about some experiences I had that were concerning. And one of them was in college, undergrad, and one of my friends who was very liberal and I was the conservative. But she was complaining about the fact that she had to take a logic course. She's like, I hate logic. I don't want to go to logic class. And I said, well, I can understand. It might be boring. I said, but, logic's pretty important. I mean, it is. And her response is, well, yeah, whatever, but I don't have to agree with logic. And my first thought was like, that was the most illogical thing I've ever heard, and yet it was meant to be. How do you even respond to that? Where logic itself isn't a value or important. I could not even fathom that anyone would think that way. And be willing to express it and hear what they said and still hold it. Wow. Still don't understand that. And it's a person I really liked, enjoyed their company, but anyway, and then in grad school, I was a theology major. I was a grad student at Boston College, and I went to a talk. I'm not going to get into the details of that talk, but it involved interreligious dialogue came up in the course of the conversation that the two speakers were having. And afterwards, one of my fellow master's students and I were speaking, and I said, well, it seems to me that the purpose of interreligious dialogue is, at its foundation, is a mutual desire for the truth. Now, maybe that was naive of me, since, not all religions necessarily care about the truth as much as, everyone tries to think that all religions are the same. They're not, okay? Read Ratzinger on the place of Christianity in the history of world religions, for instance. Okay, they're not all the same, and to say that is an insult to all of them. They don't all have the same goal. There might be some similar goals and some similarities. I'm not arguing that. I'm not saying there's not some fundamental cohesion in a way, but you can't reduce it all to that. It's much more complicated than that. And try to take that seriously. And it's not easier to think that way, but it's more in line with the reality. So, anyway, so we were talking about that, and I was like, yeah, I think mutual search for truth, right? It's that mutual recognition that you and I disagree on something, but we disagree because we both take it seriously and we want to know the truth of the matter. Like, that's the fundamental point. And is truth, search for truth, mutual search for truth. And this fellow grad student was like, oh, I don't think truth is the purpose of interreligious dialogue. And I was like, then what is? What's the point? You know, you're going to exchange ideas for what then? Like, what's the point? It literally, to me, sucked the life out of dialogue. You know, you can't learn if there's nothing to learn. You can't grow in your knowledge if there's nothing to know. If there is no truth, then what's the point? And I realized quite quickly that for a lot of these students, their goal was to get a degree, to get letters after their names that let them say exactly what they've always thought before they began their studies, and therefore assert that it's an educated opinion. Well, guess what? If a scientist doesn't follow the scientific method, his opinion is meaningless. It doesn't matter. And that's true even, I would argue, in theology. Okay? You can't say, well, I have a PhD in theology and or religious studies, and therefore I think, you know, that red roses are actually, you know, brown or something. You know, I don't know. Whatever. I mean, if you're colorblind, I guess they are. My point is, like, you can't just say whatever you want. If it's not based on the science, in the methodological activity of your discipline, then it doesn't count. You can't, a chemist can't just say that he doesn't believe in peptide bonds, you know, without some sort of evidence to back it up that's based on the proper procedures for a chemist. Okay? You just can't do that. It's not how it works. And yet, a lot of people are getting degrees, especially in the humanities, not to learn and to grow and to teach how to think, but to assert. So that they can get a degree and say, well, I have a doctorate in this field, and therefore, I think this, therefore that is true in my field. And then people will quote them. Oh, well, a doctorate of theology said, blah, 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 blah. Okay, was that found in scripture and or tradition? Was that a result of actual combing the evidence that was present before you, or was it your theological assertion based on your socio-political views and your agenda? You know, those aren't the same thing. And a lot of people do. They get graduate degrees so that their opinion can be seen as more valid without actually wanting to do the hard work of thinking. And, you know, there's always a tendency for us to do that. We want to reduce things the easiest things possible. We don't want to have to challenge ourselves. But it doesn't do us any good. And we'll find that we're much more content and happy, and even when we're challenged and can work through that. And I really believe that. You should be uncomfortable if you can't answer the objections. It doesn't mean you crumble. I mean, there has to be some, you know, psychological well-being or health there to be able to deal with it. But just because a person asks a question of you that you can't prove one way or the other doesn't mean you're wrong either. It doesn't make them right, which a lot of people seem to think that if I can just, you know, be a skeptic and pose a question that they can't answer doesn't necessarily mean that I'm right, right? You can't just lob a question that they can't answer and say, see, I got you. What does that prove? It doesn't prove your point at all. It doesn't. So, you know, don't make that mistake either. My point being is you have to learn to think, and I think Bernard Lonergan actually had an insight on this. I don't really know a lot about Bernard Lonergan and his whole version of transcendental Thomism. I know much more about Rahner and Ratzinger and the like. But I will say that in his method, there were some insights that I think derived from his book, Insight, that talked about different levels of intellection, maybe is a way of putting it, of knowledge. And so there's, different stages that you go through, and 4 major stages. The first is data collection, right? You observe, gather in information, so data points, if you will. The second level is the level of understanding, and that's where you see meaning, you see patterns in the data, so that those brute facts start to mean something. They have an import, right? Not just an application necessarily, that might be the case, but they have some sort of meaning behind them. They express something. They're not just mere facts, but have meaning. And that's sort of like the aha movement. Like, oh, I see it. It's a level of intelligence, right? Oh, I see the pattern. I can perceive that from the data. There's some sense to it. But I think that's where most people stop, because in some sense it's a level of instinct, right? As creatures with intelligence, we can gather or see patterns in things, but we're not always right, and this is where I think the rational part becomes important, because that's stage 3, which most people, I think a lot of the time, a lot of us do not go beyond level 2. We stay there at understanding, and by understanding, it typically is just our instinct on what we first see, what we perceive, how we feel about it, right? Because our thinking and feeling often go together. Oh, well, yeah, okay, no, I see it. That's why we get excited when we have an insight, right? But then we need to test it, and that's the role of the rational stage, the third stage, is to test your hypothesis, if you will. The hypothesis is a level of understanding. The next level is rationality. That's when you test your own theory. Am I actually seeing what's right? Is my perception of the pattern correct? Or is there a different pattern that is better at explaining the data set? And that's basically where you try to prove yourself wrong. You expose your own theory or hypothesis or insight to questioning. You question yourself. You don't just assume that because it's your impulse and your first gut instinct and reaction that it's true. I think most of the time we go from the second level, all the way to the judgment level, which is the 4th level. And that's where basically you choose to act according to the results of the 3rd stage, which is after you subject your thought to the test, then you make a decision. But if you skip that stage, and you go right from the 2nd to the 4th, you go right from, oh, this is what I think, this is what I see, without reflection, without self-criticism, and go right to the next level of just of decision and assertion, that's where you get into trouble. And that's when you start being unwilling to listen to other people. Why? Because I know I'm right? That's how it is. You become so certain without reflection that you can't handle challenge, because you've already came to a level of decision about it, right? So now someone's questioning that decision. That means they're questioning your what you saw, right? Your insight. Well, how can you question that? I know I had that insight, so I know I'm right because I perceived it. You didn't bother to question it. Or if you did, you obviously couldn't do it perfectly, and maybe someone has another idea that pushes it further along, and there's nothing wrong with that. You have to be open to that. And that's what I don't like about our current political situation at all, because there's no room for that anymore. It boggles my mind when I look at our political landscape now, and I'm like, I don't agree with anybody. I might agree on certain policy or not, but the philosophy behind it is often different. And it's disturbing because then I see the political parties as sort of just, they're literally defined by their enemies, right? I mean, it's like, let's say that there's a political issue that comes up, issue number 5, right? It's like, well, who's going to take what side? Now, if the political parties had a basic philosophy that was stable, you could predict who it was going to be, or who would take what side of the issue, right? And there, in some sense, there's ability to do that, but it's primarily based on past experience about a similar issue, right? And yet it doesn't always work. Why? Because if someone from one party says something or makes a judgment, it's like everyone from the other party immediately says, no, they're wrong. And then you're like, well, wow, like that Republican just said something that seems like something a Democrat would say, and now the Democrats are against it because the Republicans said it, even though normally I would expect them to agree with it. And it's like literally just a, no, well, I can't agree with them, so I'm going to hold the opposite. I think in some ways I think about that about the Patriot Act. I would not have typically thought the Patriot Act would be a Republican value, and yet the Republicans defended it, and the Democrats were the ones going against it. And I was like, I think that was for me a moment where I go, I don't understand the philosophy behind these political parties anymore, because I don't know that they have one anymore. That's at least in any way, shape, or form consistent. So anyway, that's my little rant. My point being is I hope more people will begin to emulate their method of dialogue. If not their actual positions, at least the ability to have a dialogue and discuss these things, because that is what we need more than anything. Otherwise, the fragmentation will continue to grow, and it won't end until the pot just boils over completely and it all explodes. And it might not be for another 50 years, 100 years, I don't know, but whatever it is not good. And we should be willing to speak about things more calmly and self-reflectively and more humbly. I don't think that humble doesn't mean just giving up your position before you start, or as soon as it's challenged, say, all right, well, never mind. You have something valuable to say too, and what you think does matter. And just because someone's more intelligent than you doesn't even mean that they're right. That's not how that works. We could prove that logically, but I'll leave that to others right now. But I just really hope that this is the start of a new form of discussion. A new common search for good answers to tough questions. Because otherwise, I don't see any other solution, or I don't see any other conclusion than what we've already experienced in the 20th century, which was not pretty. Where it all did become a will to power, and that never ends well for humanity. Let's learn from that mistake, and let's move forward in dialogue, talking about our disagreements, and seriously trying to understand the other side before we condemn it completely. You might disagree with it, that's fine. But don't just look at their conclusions, look at their reasons as well. And you'll understand a lot more and be able to be more effective at, maybe bring them over to your side if you can understand where they're coming from. So don't be afraid of that. Learn and be honest about, don't use straw people. Don't set up a false enemy and attack it. Give your enemy the best possible defense, In that sense, be a scholastic insofar as you have to come up with the best arguments against your position that you can, the objections, and take real ones that people have, and then respond to those. Don't reduce your people who disagree with you's position to the most absurd statement that no one would really make, that's not intellectually honest, and it does nobody any good. And it just reduces the level of conversation even further, which reduces our collective humanity even further. So contribute, and contribute well, first by listening and then by speaking and dialoguing back and forth with mutual respect. And I hope we can continue that, and I hope more of us will begin to do that very thing. Thank you, and have a great day.